And now these buildings of this era, possibly the last time we had great public sector architecture departments within government, these are now being preserved as buildings of very, very great architectural and historical importance.
I'll just come in on this one. I like this one because I walked past this at the weekend. I went for a walk with my daughter on my birthday, and this is a very long way away from the centre of town. This is right on the northwestern edge of London. This building, very strange building. This is the civic centre. This is the council headquarters for Hillingdon Council. And this was very much published when I was an architecture student. And the reason was because this was the first major example of a public building that rejected this language of simple modernity. This was the start, and this was another start in private housing of this crisis of style, crudely. And you see that playing out through all of this world here, of architects with the public becoming uncertain of what buildings should look like. And this was an attempt to make a very familiar reference to 1920s and earlier historic style of architecture. It's actually quite an amazing building, actually. This one feels like a less good building, I would say. When this went up, to many of us, this was a symbol of the architectural confusion of the 80s. This is an office block that was glitzy, expensive looking, but trying to be like something historic with turrets. And now we look at it and you quite like it. You know there won't ever be another one like this. It's a slightly insane building. But at the time it seemed so embarrassing that the architects were so confused about what to do.
Hey, when we move into the 1980s, it's interesting again just to look back. As Mark has said, this kind of crisis of confidence here, different styles which are competing, and again here during the 1970s, possibly one of the areas of the greatest change in British society and in London, reflecting the economic trouble of the country at the time, the decline of the public sector, the beginnings of the growth of the private sector. But when we come into the 1980s, what we see here, it's dominated by commercial buildings. In the middle of the 1980s, the City of London changed its regulations. London began to emerge as a major financial centre. And this triggered a huge amount of commercial development and commercial architecture. And the pivot of this is Canary Wharf. This in 1983-84 was disused dock area. It was derelict in the east of London. And a completely mad idea from an American-Canadian investor to turn this into the second big commercial centre. It was mad, it was crazy, and it worked. He went bankrupt as well, but it worked. But it did produce in London the first examples of the North American commercial style. And one of the differences between these buildings in the City of London, the old historic core, with a medieval street pattern, and the commercial developments in the old docks, was that here there's complete freedom of, you can build any floor plate you like on large sites. And the 1980s was dominated financially by very large office buildings for trading on trading commodities. And Canary Wharf filled that part of the market But the difference between the architecture is very apparent. And again, later when we see some of the buildings in the city, the architecture in the centre of London is largely determined by placing buildings on very, very awkward sites. Here, this isn't a problem at all. And therefore, the architecture of the two financial cores of London are completely different.
So this was our first proper, by North American, one characteristic that was fat. This is a fat building. There's been no building, this tower, this fat. Towers are not in this kind of dimension. This has got a big concrete structure in the middle and big floors around it. This is pure Canada. Canadian developers, they brought their Canadian architects, and then they got different architects to do the wrap-up. So it was a complete shock to Europe to have these things. And of course now there are lots of these all around it.
And also, this period was characterised probably by two growing architectural practices, Norman Foster and Richard Rogers, who during this period established their practices with key buildings within London and established their international reputations.
This is interesting. What do you notice about this photograph? It's the first one in the era of colour photography, which is black and white. And you'll see another black and white one over there. And not only is the photograph black and white, but it's a photograph that isn't a portrait just of the building. It's the building with everything around it. This is the building that you're looking at, supposed to be looking at on this picture, but it's showing you how it sits in the city. And there's another one over there we'll see where there's a huge tipper truck driving past, which is far larger on the photograph than the building. And these are indicators of a different kind of sensibility that was again wanting to look at the city as a whole and how you insert it. So this architect, Tony Fretton, was very significant as being a vanguard of that idea. We're going to do buildings that refer to what's around them, aren't the same, but they're more subtly adjusting, and the architecture is less expressive. In contrast to things like this, they were happening at the same time. And that seems sort of slightly crazy. This is by Terry Farrell. This is the Secret Service headquarters. Don't expect the Secret Service to have a very showy building, but they did, and indeed when built, you see here, these have all died now, but it had all these conical trees on the top, clipped trees. It's completely crazy. In the drawings of this building, they would have smoke coming out of the top, like a fantasy.
There's also a story about this building that when it was completed, when the Secret Service took possession of it, they spent about 70 million euros taking the entire internal fit-outs out to check there are no secret microphones. And then they had to refit it completely. So 70 million euros just to make sure there's no microphones left by the builders. Some more buildings from the time. We're beginning to see again, first of all, like I said, there's still this kind of interesting contrast of architectural styles, still battling it out here, but also the beginnings of very, very big infrastructure projects. This is was the terminal for the Eurostar high-speed trains to Paris and Brussels and the European network, built at Waterloo. Later on here, I think we have the initial buildings around the Jubilee line, which was the last major underground line built in London. And interestingly enough, each of the stations had an appointed architect, and probably the best collection of architects practicing at the time all left one building. and an architectural tour, the Jubilee line, is still a tremendous experience. And then we have buildings like this. This was hugely influential at the time. This actually is basically it's a public toilet. But a public toilet, and at the back a little shop selling flowers. And it was wholly very influential with a lot of local politicians who saw this as a lovely example that small architecture could create real value in their areas.
This is an interesting one. This is the first one we've seen where there's a very showy expression of being more sustainable. This is actually near where I live, near where we live, in southeast London, and it's a little library and extension to a gallery. But in some ways, everything in the architecture is subservient to expressing its greenness. It's all timber. It's got this through ventilation system. It's got this grass roof. It's like something from Germany, and it's saying, I am green. Somehow like the architectural implications of making less energy consuming buildings hadn't worked through. People wanted to show off. This is a really good example of that. Because in many ways it's not a building that works very well, but it does work in expressing its greenness.
Are there some ecological components in the project? Or is it just
I think it's got
green decoration?
Heat from heat pumps, ground source heat pumps, it's recycling its water. This is a natural ventilation system running through the building. It's got a green roof. It's built from low embodied energy materials, timber.
It's typical for the English architecture to have green buildings. Is that typical or not?
It's typical to have become greener. But the explicit expression of it is subsiding. I think like anywhere. It's become more a normal expectation.